Welcome to EESC418A. This is Lecture 7B, Revising and Editing. These are the steps where we take our draft, which was a lot of work and not a lot of fun, and we can make it a beautiful document that is concise, coherent, and a pleasure to read. I'll start with a quote by C.J. Cherry. "It is perfectly okay to write garbage as long as you edit brilliantly." And this continues on the discussion that we started with drafting. So once we've drafted a document, as we said earlier, it doesn't need to be great, it just needs to be something that we can work with. And now it's time for us to work with it. So there are a few different concepts that we'll be talking about in this lecture: revising, editing, and proofreading. They're each slightly different, although they are related. So revising is rewriting a large amount of text, moving things around, reorganizing. And think of the term revision. Revision is to see again with fresh eyes. So we're going to take a fresh look at our document. Hopefully we've set it aside for some time, either hours or better yet, a day or two. And now we're going to look at it with fresh eyes and reorganize it. We're going to read it through and we're going to add supporting information where necessary. Editing is a completely separate step that we'll do after revisions. And in editing, we'll make the text more clear, concise, and coherent without necessarily making reorganizations or major additions to our text. We'll also do proofreading, which is a meticulous look for typos and grammatical errors. Proofreading is usually going to be the last step before we submit our report, because at this point we're not making any major changes. We're just looking at the fine details of grammar. So I do have some tips for both editing and revising. So leave time in between drafting, revising, and editing. Leave at least a day if you can in between each of these steps. After you draft your document, it feels great to complete it, so set it aside, bask in the glory of having completed your document, and come back to it the next day with fresh eyes, looking at major revisions. So take your time. This also means never leave your document to the last minute. If you do, you really won't do a good revision or edit. So it's almost impossible to produce a really good document if you don't leave time at the end for revisions and editing. Another tip is don't confuse and don't try and combine the steps of revising and editing. Leave time to do these as individual steps. Next, separate the ink from the ego. This can be very difficult. We're proud of the work that we've put in. We're happy with the hard work that we've done in our drafting. And it can feel like a bit of a punishment to have to go back and delete portions of text that we've spent so much time writing. But we've got to look at this with cold eyes and say, does this text in here really matter to this document in order for me to meet my objectives? And if not, I'm sorry, but it's got to go. This is the time to be judgmental. So we need to be judgmental of our writing. This means be critical but not harsh. Don't be too hard on yourself. There's no such thing as a perfect document after the first draft. In fact, you may recall that it's not even the intention to create a great document in the first draft. The intention is to create something that we can work with in the revising and editing stage to make it a beautiful document. Next, I've said this a few times before, but don't rely on spell checkers. They are handy and they can flag some things for us, but if you come to rely on them, you're going to end up missing a lot of things. For example, a spell checker will not make your document more concise. It can give you some small tips here and there and it can flag some errors, but overall, if you are going to rely on spell checkers, you won't end up with a nice coherent document. In the revising and editing stage, it's good to be systematic, and I'll provide a few checklists at the end of this lecture. A few tips for proofreading are to read it out loud. You might want to print it off, use a ruler to look at it line by line. Some documents suggest reading sentences one line at a time and reading them backwards so that you don't get too sped up and miss things. The biggest tip though that I think that I can give you right now is to find a partner. So if you're doing an assignment or a report in this course or in other courses, find a partner that you can trade with, because it's much easier to spot mistakes in somebody else's document. So revising, what is it? It's improving your document's content, organization and structure, and ideas and meaning. So this can mean some fairly major revisions to the text. Changing the content might mean adding content, deleting content. Really, all of the 5 verbs on the right are at play here with all parts of the revision. So we can add supporting information, we can cut information if it's either redundant or repetitive, we can replace words or paragraphs, we can replace entire sections actually. We can outline the text. In other words, we can go through and change the outline or add to the outline, add subsections if we think that the text that we've written merits an entire section on its own. Or we can just move things around to make it a more logical flow. Editing, on the other hand, is all about grammar and punctuation and making the document more clear. So clear, concise, coherent, effective, and interesting. We'll want to use more active verbs, check for all of the grammatical and mechanical issues that we went through in the first 5 lectures. All of these come into play in editing. We want to proofread the document. We can do this paragraph by paragraph. Within each paragraph, we can go line by line and even word by word. This is where we want to do a very careful read, and we want to do it very slowly and not skim over, because our brains will fill in lots of spaces where we've missed a word or misspelled something. Our brain will not alert us to this because it knows what we're thinking, and it will just skip right over these errors. But if you read it word by word very slowly, particularly if you read it out loud or have somebody else read it out loud, you're more likely to find these typos. When you're editing, focus on your weaknesses. If you know that you have a problem with apostrophes, take your time and check every apostrophe. Similarly, if you have issues with hyphens or any other basic grammatical element, take your time with those and really watch for them and look up in your grammar book how to properly use them if you're ever in doubt. The more you do this, the more you'll become very adept at that type of grammar, and it'll become easy with time. So I've provided a checklist for both revisions and editing. So here's the revision checklist. And you'll find a few more checklists like this in the documents that I've linked to. Although most of those checklists are longer, I've tried to keep the really key points in this checklist. So does all the text support your document's objectives? This means looking through your document and deleting anything that is not directly related to the objectives, or at least indirectly. Anything that's not supporting your main thesis can be deleted, or it might mean you just haven't written it properly and you haven't tied it properly to your thesis or objective. And this raises the question, have you stated your objectives clearly? Sometimes you can be reading through and you can realize that this doesn't exactly match the objective that I've written, and it might just be that the objective wasn't written properly. So you can go back and check that. Because the objectives will set your reader's expectations for the entire document. So if you've improperly set objectives, you're also going to confuse your reader. Speaking of your reader, will your audience understand and care about your content? If you've written a lot of information that you're interested in but your reader won't be, you might consider deleting it. Next is, have you critically reviewed the logic? Remember the logical fallacies? We all fall into some of these traps if we already believe what we're saying. And it's difficult for us sometimes to spot logical fallacies when we make them ourselves. So anytime you've said therefore, or you've tried to show some sort of cause and effect, look back and critically examine that and ask yourself, would a reader who's never heard my argument before believe this? Should they believe this? Would they ask for more information? Next, does the organization flow from general to specific and back to general? Again, this applies to your whole document, where you'll have a fairly general introduction, specific methods and results, and then a general conclusion. And it also applies to your paragraphs, where you'll have a general topic sentence backed by specific information within the paragraph, and you may or may not close the paragraph with a more general statement. Does your flow follow a chronological order? This typically applies to a whole document, although it more applies to individual sections, for example, your methods and your results. It makes a lot of sense to the reader if you followed a chronological order. Is your conclusion supported by the presented facts? And the key point here is the presented facts. You may already believe your conclusion, but that doesn't really matter unless you've presented the facts to your reader so that they can follow along. The next checklist is for editing, and it's a little bit more specific. You might want to use this as an actual checklist that you check off as you go. So grammar and punctuation. check for clauses, check for subject-verb agreement, check the modifiers, fragments and splices. Each sentence can be checked for these things. You might want to do an entire read-through looking for acronyms, definitions, and references. In other words, have you defined your acronyms? Do you have jargon or other technical language that needs to be defined in the text? And have you cited a reference? And if so, is that reference included at the end of the document? Remember the common errors, homonyms, jargon, and cliches. Keep your eye open for these. This is something that you can read through and look for in editing. A fairly simple check that will have a big impact on the readability of your document is looking for topic sentences. Every paragraph should have a topic sentence. And then remember coherence. Have you used transitional phrases, parallel construction, and a consistent verb tense throughout, hopefully the active verb tense. Remember the tone. It should be polite and formal in a technical document. And then conciseness. Have you used any words that are unnecessary? Remember all the empty phrases that we went through. Next, check for concrete and specific language. If you've said some vague statements, you might want to follow them up or replace them altogether with concrete and specific phrases. Finally, you can check about how you've communicated any uncertainty. Anything in the future is almost always uncertain, and you should qualify it appropriately in a technical document. Okay, so I know this checklist is a lot, as is the revision checklist, but I do believe that if you follow this when you're writing a document, you'll end up with a much better technical document. This applies to your coursework, your future careers, and really anything that you're writing. So please take your time with this. Remember to leave lots of time with your assignments and your future reports. Leave time for a full revision and a full editing, preferably one day apart. If you do, I can promise you your reports will be nice and clear and readable, and your readers will appreciate it. That's all for Lecture 7B. See you in the next lecture.